All right, so we're talking about a subject here, programmatic, that I think has been in some ways talked to death. And I don't think we just want to say the things that everybody is saying, because you've heard them before. And I don't think that we're going to use the word data 150 times, because I don't think that it's necessary. I think fundamentally programmatic is driven by data. So let's just know that we're talking about data at the core of all of this. So I actually want to start with this. I was prompted by something that the gentleman from Air Canada was talking about. He was talking about these relationships with consumers that he would like to be able to foster and having more data about them. But it struck me that he's talking about customers. And fundamentally, when we're talking about programmatic as it exists today, we're really talking about advertising. And there's a funny kind of crisis going on in advertising right now. I think Scott talked about it a little bit this morning while I was lost trying to find the building, but I heard that he talked about it this morning. We have ad blocker usage skyrocketing. We have skippable ads on television. And even the Super Bowl, if you look at the highest rated ad in the Super Bowl using the ad meter, it's been trending downward for like 20 years. So something feels like it's going wrong. And yet, fundamentally, advertising is a sort of a core driver of how brands and consumers find each other. So I want to talk a little bit about what all of that means in the context of programmatic. That was long-winded, but hopefully it just helps you understand the bigger picture, I think, of how we should be thinking about all of these things. So let's start with this question of transparency. I'm just curious what transparency means today, as opposed to a year or a couple of years ago in conversations that you are having with your brands, with your partners. So Tracey, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think a few years ago, transparency was really about just making sure that clients knew each and every line item of an Excel spreadsheet. The good part at the agency is that I feel like we've moved past that. We've brought in tons of consultants. Clients have brought in whoever they want. So we've moved past that. I think the key to transparency now is, and what we figured out during the transparency piece, is that clients, frankly, weren't asking the right questions. And as agencies, sometimes we weren't giving the right information. And so we were like two ships passing in the night, that we each thought each other understood each other, and we didn't. And then we created this issue where, well, by not understanding each other, now we have some challenges. And so I'm finding that transparency even more today means education for clients. That took education inside the agency's walls, but it also takes education. So in a month, I'm presenting to large CMO, what is a DMP? She probably doesn't quite need to know that on a day-to-day basis, but the knowledge that I want to equip her with to know, so that she sits in another meeting and can almost play this game of like, all right, now that I understand what that does, how can I connect these pieces together? So I'd say transparency today, more than Excel spreadsheets that I think it meant last few years, has meant education so that you can be having the right discussions instead of this sort of like over each other, around each other discussion to actually solve the problem.
Maybe Erica, for you then also as a leader at an agency?
Yeah, I would agree with what Tracey said, that it's moved beyond the understanding or the need or desire for an understanding of what goes into the Excel spreadsheet and the notion of the compensation models that exist within the programmatic ecosystem for an agency, as it were. But I think, the journey that we're going on is we've of course have had this similar notion of we need to make sure that there's education there. I think more for us, transparency is about everything, right? And I think that's transparency that's not just specific to programmatic. I think it's transparency to our agency sister partners, transparency within our client businesses, and transparency as a norm. Our employees they expect transparency as well. And so for us, what it really means is clients now really, they want to get as deep as possible. A year ago, we had a client who said, okay, I don't understand, a big advertiser, said we just don't understand this whole programmatic thing. So we want to go deep. We want to go under the hood. After the second slide where we started to go deep, they walked away.
Really?
And just said, they were like, oh, it's too complicated. But a year now, today, even the clients where we feel like we have absolute full transparency with, right? Like they sit with our traders or our campaign managers, as we call them. They sit with us. They understand the decisions that we make around architecting their technology solutions and everything, but they want to go even deeper. And that's, okay, we're going to partner with a third party who's going to help us understand the tech tax that exists throughout the
Yeah, we're gonna talk
ecosystem,
about that.
which is finally the right thing, because so much of transparency in the early, in the past couple of years has been, let's focus on the bad guys. The bad guys must be the agencies. No, actually, everybody has the best intent in this industry, and I get really irritated that it has a
Except
bad
the
name.
fraudsters, but mostly.
Okay, fair enough. But I think there are bad actors who have ruined it for the good actors.
Yep.
And the Oscar Award actors are the ones who deserve to win those awards. And I think the more transparency that we can have throughout the ecosystem beyond us as agency partners or trading desks, which is a vernacular I don't like, beyond the buy-side platforms is the rightful thing. Not because, I think the intent of it being, well, let's shave the costs that exist. All of these working costs are working costs to deliver the outcomes that we're all targeting or looking to achieve. And I think the more transparency and understanding that people will get will help the notion of, and the progress of this as a particular mechanism for which we buy
Okay,
media.
I want to come back to that because I want to talk later about kind of media management models and the in-housing thing. And I think there's some sort of much larger issues that are creating these trends that are happening. So I love that, and we'll put a pin in that for a second. It's maybe a nice segue into supply chain management and kind of what's happening there. But just Ed, in brief, before we go there, what does transparency in your technology mean?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think both answers, like context is so important as to how you respond to the question of transparency. But I think generally when customers are talking to us, it's either sort of transparency in price, transparency in source or provenance of inventory or data, transparency in governance, and making sure that you're doing what you say you're doing, if you will. And then probably the last piece is I would say choice, transparency and choice, or sort of the concept of notice and choice as to actually how people are being informed and being educated, to Tracey's point, so that they can actually make informed choices. So I think of it in the sort of those 3 or 4 areas when people are speaking to us. But I do think, you're hearing from these responses, it's contextual in terms of who's asking the question, who they're asking it to, and also sort of when they're asking the question, what point of their journey.
Boy, the notice and choice thing. I was thinking about consumers in this dynamic, and we'll come to them in a minute. But
I want to raise the word transparency up a level.
okay,
And I want to equate the word transparency with trust. And actually, I think it really goes well to your story about the client who said, I want to know about a DMP, and then they kind of walked away. In a transparent relationship, in a relationship between buyer, seller, client, service provider, technology partner, and any one of these relationships, when transparency gets to the level at which the other party has full trust, then transparency is no longer the conversation at all. Like, nobody's asking for transparency if fundamental trust already exists,
Right, so
because
we're-
they assume.
we're clearly not there yet.
Yes, and that's what I think we've got to elevate the conversation to that level.
Well, right, easier said than done, right? I mean, part of it is we've gone down this sort of horrible rabbit hole where fundamentally programmatic is neither a good nor bad thing. If you're using data and you're using technology and you're using machine learning to do real-time decisioning, there's nothing inherently good or bad about that. But we went down this sort of terrible path for some I think important and real reasons. But you're right, it's caused problems that perhaps we're sort of now all having to deal with.
To regain trust.
Right, okay, so trust. If it's about trust then, how do we think about the consumer and the trust of the consumer in advertising? Where they're ad blocking us and they're...
Sure. So I think as agency professionals in this room, we can all agree that we've flooded the consumer with too many messages, too many of which are not relevant, and in some ways destroyed the experience for the consumer. Now, I don't blame us. I mean, I think we're all in an industry that is trying to retain the consumer attention when the consumer's attention is more and more fragmented every day.
And the translation to try and get the consumer attention is let's barrage them with
Exactly.
irrelevant messaging.
And
how many
and
impressions
just
can you deliver?
right, and then we also have in this industry somewhere along the line, probably when we were all just understanding digital, so 15, 20 years ago, we all agreed that the impression is the thing and the cost per impression is the thing, and those are way wrong.
And it was fundamentally treated as direct response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's hours of panel we could have here.
Get
I won't
ready.
go there. I won't go there. But
Hours.
so back to the consumer, I think we almost are at this moment in time when we have permission. We have permission to hit the reset button. We have amazingly engaged marketers that 2 years ago were kind of abdicating responsibilities, and now they're engaged. And some of them I see in this room, and thank you, to say, whoa, it's okay to change the fundamental paradigm of how we get a message in front of a consumer. Many of people in this room were probably kids in the Gulf War. But the Gulf War, when we left the Gulf War, we had this national moment when we could have completely changed our dependency on oil.
Because everybody was like, going. It could go south very quickly.
Right. I won't let it. And we didn't. We allowed the entire economy of automotive and oil-based products and consumption to continue the way it was at a moment when there was actually a willingness in this country to go green.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the same spot in advertising. There's been finally a recognition that this crack cocaine of open programmatic with too cheap CPMs to actually be for real was a sham. And we could all actually hit the reset button today. Like if everybody jumped in the pool together,
Yeah, I hear you.
we could change the fundamental way in which the message from the advertiser touches the consumer.
By the way, everybody truly means everybody. Everybody means
Everybody.
brands rethinking this. Agency compensation is a race to the bottom.
Yes.
Brands rethinking this. The success in television means lower CPMs than last year, right? Agencies finding ways to be compensated that do not end up in 23-year-olds who, Tracey loves this one, untrained 23-year-olds who are just pushing buttons blindly. Okay. Hit the pause button for a second.
I did. I was going to drop the mic. But.
It's just not as effective as dropping a mic, though.
You got to flip it in.
Tracy,
Yeah.
supply chain management, right? We have, I think, marketers asking questions. We have marketers leaning into technology relationships. We have marketers asking about things like, as Erica mentioned, the tech tax. What's happening there? How are you thinking about that with your brand partners?
So I think that the challenge that we have on behalf of the marketers is that the majority of the relationships we sit truly with the DSPs. And so the challenge is to the degree...
the relationship between the brand and the DSP?
And the brand is buying through the DSPs, right? And so the relationships that marketers should be having with their SSPs, I think is relatively nascent in the majority of the space. So what we've devised, truly, is to put a ton of pressure, and I'm talking contractually the most pressure we've ever placed, on the demand-side platforms to help us clean up the supply-side platforms. I was going to go back to programmatic. So when we all started in programmatic, do you remember they were like, "You're all going to be out of a job, and like, we're going to reduce the teams by like 2/3, and like I was so excited and thought we'd just like have half days and everything."
Yeah. That's
oh my
what
God.
happened.
And I think I sat on a panel like 10 years ago and said every day is like whack-a-mole. And then I had a client say, "Do you really think that?" And I said, "I do. You should like come hang out for one day at the agency and watch the things that we have to deal with that are happening in programmatic." And so as I think about, there has to be at some point pressure put somewhere to make something happen, or else we're all just going to keep pointing at each other.
Yeah.
And so, party of one, the opinion I've taken is to put extreme pressure on the DSPs to make my contracts so that they don't incentivize from fraud, they don't incentivize from over user frequency, they get zero. And when they get zero, I imagine their business can't happen unless they cut off paying the supply.
Yep.
And so that's really where I feel like my point of view has been and has rendered some good results.
And how does that make you feel, Ed?
Typically like it.
Seeing that you're in charge of revenue.
I think Tracey's point is a fair one and a good one in terms that the pressure needs to be put on the supply chain somewhere. Whether it should be put on sort of the companies that own the DSPs or if it should be put upstream in the SSPs. I think who's in a better position to solve the problems and why you have companies like TrustX form, right, is the SSP or the marketplace is probably in the best position to solve the problem. However, and I think this is sort of the meta point Tracey's making is like if the incentives are misaligned though, throughout the supply chain and you don't have a direct relationship, you're going to have sort of misincentivized or sort of mischievous behavior potentially. But I do think like it's, and you don't need to get in the weeds of it, it becomes a much thornier issue when you're talking about payment, when you're talking about sort of the relationship. Because remember, now the SSPs are also, and Dave's in a better position to talk about this, we're also a marketplace of many, many publishers, right? Thousands, if not hundreds or tens of thousands of publishers that are also expecting payment and putting pressure downstream. One of the issues, and then there's this massive financing issue in this industry that no one talks about, right? That we have.
Why don't you talk about it?
Well, let's just talk about, maybe in context of what's happened over the last 2 days, as interest rates begin to rise and we see sort of, the turmoil or the volatility, I should say, in the stock markets. If you think those are related to interest rates, and if you think that there's been a lot of cheap funding in this business and a lot of cheap financing in this business, watch out because people are going to run out of cash. And what's going to happen is you're going to have consolidation. You're going to be left with very few marketplaces, right? So if we all think the world is a good place, if the only supply source is Google,
we'll come back to that.
Maybe that's that's potentially what's happening. And look at the independent SSP markets, right? Look at the Rubicon stock price. Look at right what's going on with you call people out, but like there's a real financial issue in this business that no one talks about, and it starts with cheap money, and as money is starting to get more expensive, people who do not have strong balance sheets, and again, we're getting really wonky here, but like it's going to be a real problem, right? And payment is getting pushed out further and further and further, not just, and it's happening to the agencies, it's happening to to the partners, if you will, and that whole economic chain is going to collapse.
The day that I learned that that the SSPs are paid before the agencies even reviewed the report about whether those impressions were fraudulent or non-fraudulent, I died. I was like, I'm sorry, no one wants to know whether what we are about to pay for actually happened. You just are going to pay them? Well, a standard's been set by a specific SSP that is the payment terms, and if we don't pay in those payment terms, then we can't get the inventory that SSP can all get. And I was like, wow. So just the complexity is deep, and that inhibits our ability to actually then be able to drive some of the expectations and changes, in which case you got to apply the pressure somewhere.
How do you incentivize good behavior, Erica? And then obviously I'll ask you.
Well, I think Tracey and I could probably echo each other all this panel.
We can just go.
Just do it.
But
do it. Amen.
It's the very same thing. We absolutely are spending time with the DSPs, whom are our core partners, to say this ecosystem needs to change, and you need to take on some culpability about how you're policing this ecosystem. And of course, there's also the conversation with our publisher partners about, obviously, to your point, the death of the open exchange, as it were. We are doing, and we do have a motivation towards doing a lot more in the programmatic marketplaces, PMPs or guaranteed or what have you. But I think it's going to take a long time for that change to happen, right? Because, we have legacy contracts. When things like invalid traffic come up from a serious offender this year, they were refusing culpability on it. And, it's a large player, and they are difficult to negotiate with. So, again, for the change to happen, we all have to push that change. And obviously, I think everybody knows who I'm talking about when I say who we need to push for change.
No one will say their name.
Creepy. You did say it. You said Voldemort.
Yeah, there you go.
But I think, well, my only premise about this is that this industry, and we're doing it right here, we have a tendency to talk to ourselves about the challenges that exist within the ecosystem, whether it's about fraudulent impressions, whether it's about, who's taking what cut of what dollar, and whether or not that's rightfully theirs or not in the context of how the ecosystem works. And I think that's all well and great, and we do need to push ourselves to build that trust and to make sure that that's all even. But let's also focus that this still does deliver results on behalf of our advertisers. We would not be sitting here 10 years after this industry started, where of course we did think the pace of change was going to be much more rapid. The disruption was going to be much more violent than it has been. But it still does pay off when you do it right. When you solution architect, I love that title, by the way, but when you solution architect, the right construct and stack for an advertiser, and you focus on using the right data and the right technology, it does deliver outcomes. And you have to just cut out all the garbage before you even start thinking about, before you even start executing. So I get, and I talked about this when we were preparing for this meeting, sometimes we focus too much on the bad. Let's also highlight this does work. Like, yes, it may be and now I'm soapboxing, so I apologize, Joanna, but this may be an existential crisis for.
Would you like a mic to drop?
for advertising, and I agree, because there has been a lot of bad actors, but there is also some good that's out there. Like, when you actually use the data to customize and curate the messaging, even before it gets personalized, it does pay off. We do see the rewards on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I feel like we have the opportunity to get back to what can be great about advertising. Like there is something.
Gonna make advertising great again?
Is that your tagline?
Just asking.
Is it really? Let's make advertising great again.
We're gonna get hats.
Oh, God. It's so horrible. There's something magical about great desire creation. If you self-select all your advertising, you select yourself into a tiny little hole, and you never learn about anything that you didn't know existed in the world that you want.
Also, I mean, to echo Erica's point and to connect it to your earlier thought, like the things that Erica just mentioned, the curation, the sort of, the customization of the inventory, like that's going to go a long way to solving some of this sort of consumer rejection of advertising as well, right? I mean, again, talking about like one of the issues is when you're over-impressioning or over-frequency or misaligning context, misaligning inventory, right? The customer's getting, or the consumer, however you want to think about them, is getting very little value, right? Like
totally.
And I think that we have long taken for granted that there is the world of television and sort of the technology that was available as that construct created a quid pro quo, which was you receive advertising, you receive free content. Technology today has completely disrupted that, right? So I reject that status quo. And now, Mr. and Mrs. Advertiser, you have to provide me something of real value if you want to interrupt my experience.
Although, hilariously, did you notice that Netflix, which does not accept advertising, advertised in the Super Bowl? So crazy, right?
Well, I mean,
There's something there.
Netflix did, Amazon Prime did, Hulu did, right? So, I mean, there's a number of...
Yeah, but Netflix doesn't even accept advertising.
True.
Well, they do in their content.
Yeah.
What's that?
They do in their content. It's a different advertising model, but it's
all right, fair
branded
point.
content.
So, can you talk to me about how you, with TrustX, are maybe creating or recreating an environment of trust between publishers and sellers, which ultimately, I think, hopefully will benefit consumers?
I'm gonna,
Or do you not want to talk about that? You
No.
want to talk about something else?
I'll be happy to talk about that,
Okay.
and I want to talk about all three, because I
Okay.
think you're right.
Okay.
It's publishers, advertisers, and consumers.
Yep.
So the first thing is, and when I say the word, it's a demand side fee, where does that end, right? Does everybody agree that's like up to the DSP, and then there's this really thick, murky line, and then the rest of, when I say there's a supply side fee, that must be the exchange, yes. Like, it's very clear in this industry that there is a line between that which is on the demand side, the advertiser side, and that which is on the publisher or supply side.
Okay.
And so the first thing that we're doing is I'm erasing that line. So we believe that every advertiser that buys advertising through TrustX should know exactly the publisher on which that advertising ran and exactly at what price the advertising ran, and how much of that price included was partly our fee and how much got to the publisher. And we are reporting every single week back to every single buyer, your agency, and all these clients, what they are buying through TrustX. And they're thrilled because they don't get that in any other supply side because of the thick, murky line that I just described. So the first thing we're doing and by the way, we do that the same way for the publisher. They know every single advertiser that bought on their platform and how much the advertiser paid and how much we kept in our transparent fee. So the first thing we're doing is trying to restore the trust by simply saying, you guys, we're in a transaction, we help facilitate, and here's how that transaction worked. And everybody knows all the time at any level of detail you want to know. If you want to log into our portal and you're a buyer, go ahead, knock your socks off. Okay? That's the first thing we're doing. The second thing we're doing in TrustX, which relates to our consumer vision here, is we know among the premium publisher community, they have been caught up in this race to put more and more advertising on their sites because if one publisher reduces the ad load dramatically, they're going to lose when the other publisher has all these additional impression opportunities.
Yeah.
But many of our publishers have said to us, geez, I really actually believe that if we dramatically decluttered our environment, if we created a place where consumers love to engage in our content, that not only will they stay longer, but they'll actually notice the advertising. And so one of the other things that TrustX is doing is a series of experiments where we are using the power of the 35 content publishers, that are our members to A/B test different consumer experiences. And because everyone's jumping in the pool together, because all these publishers are at the same time going to cease to create cluttered advertising environments, we actually will have a scalable environment with which to test whether, in fact, the consumer leans in longer, pays attention longer, and has higher brand recall on the very messages that are fueling the economics of this ecosystem.
So will CPMs go up enough to support the publisher businesses if they drop from 15 ads a page to 1?
I hope so.
And what does that mean for agencies and marketer budgets?
I hope that we will remember that at the end of the day, the advertiser is paying for the opportunity for a consumer to digest the ad message.
I do feel like that shift is starting to happen.
I love that.
Conversations around
Yes.
how long was a consumer exposed, at what frequency, and what is the cumulative impact of some overarching measurement of exposure, for example.
I think it's all, just to go back to that, I talked a little while ago about this, it's the moment we can all hit the reset button. That's part of the reset button, is reminding ourselves that the purpose of advertising is to influence the consumer to do something, to like the brand, to engage with the brand, and ultimately to make the purchase or to experience whatever the brand is that they're selling. And programmatic has clouded the purpose of advertising. It has become a race to how many times can you throw advertising in front of the consumer at the cheapest possible price.
This is what's depressing about it, is again, the fundamentals of programmatic have done no such thing, but it's sort of how we've used them, right?
But the promise is missed. The promise could have been
I hear you.
everything.
We're not disagreeing on that. So you three, I'm interested, we're talking about regaining consumer trust and taking more control. How are you seeing that play out in advertisers leaning into wanting to manage this stuff more themselves?
Maybe I'm just lucky. Maybe I'm not getting that question anymore.
The in-housing, they're
No.
not doing that?
I don't get it anymore. What I get is either at our own agency, or I have just, through the experience of working in the industry a while, chat with individuals about how should I organize my agency team? How should I organize, because you guys seem to have figured something out, but I don't even know how to organize them to get the what my expected learnings, my expected pace of my campaigns run. And so that's what I was saying. I've been helping just because I think that we've hit on some interesting, the teams that I've been running, we put programmatic inside the teams. I'm a huge purist that I think it's just simply the automation of what we do. And like today digital, tomorrow, we're actually in some tests right now. We're planning all of our print on one of our clients through a DMP because of some access to some data. So if it's just the way that we automate what we do, we've got to put those things inside the group. The problem, and this is where I was hitting on before, is we haven't really brought down the complication factor in order to release our time to be doing more high-level strategic working that actually, I mean, the strategy is nothing more than what does the brand want and what does the consumer need? What's the tension that sits between those two things and the advertising that's going to solve it? And we have just bogged ourselves down with too much complication in programmatic that we've needed to move people out of strategy into execution because it's simply just like a shit show of every day, another report, another this. I mean, you said building trust. Do you know how many emails we had to get about the next brand that showed up against a terrible video? Oh, and then 2 weeks later, the next brand that showed up against a terrible video. Those were bummer emails to get because they just kept eroding trust that that the marketer had that we had it under control. But if we all just agree that like we're all trying to get this under control, then we'd have more time and energy. So it's a long way of saying just focusing on how we, on in-house versus not in-house, I don't get that question, and it's like refreshing because the last time we saw each other, it was a whole thing about how it's better in-house than on the agency side, and I'm still in the agency.
She means her. She's pointing at me without pointing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I made her mad.
So, but now I just get, now that you guys are doing it this way, how do we organize a team so that they're best constructed to be answering these questions, but also leave time for strategy, which is all we're talking about to make the consumer experience better?
You know, I will say, back at Forrester again, I am getting asked that question. I am having brands call me up and say, how should I organize my team? I'm planning on bringing it in-house in 2018. And I say, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about why you think this is the right thing to do before we talk about how to organize around it. Because I just don't think that it's always the right answer. And I want to understand what it is they even mean by that and what they're talking about. Erica, what are you seeing there?
I mean, listen, I think all these things are cyclical. And, you know,
Yeah.
I had a search background. I'm now in programmatic. The death of search was predicted that it was all going to go in-house, and it swung back the other direction. And I think we're seeing that with a couple of our core clients who, you know, you mentioned earlier, they've hired consultants from the outside because of the fear-mongering around programmatic or the, hey, we see an opportunity to consult and guide you on this. And we've always welcomed that, and we've wanted to partner through that. And what we found is a lot of our advertisers have said, okay, we're going to take this thing in-house. And then they have an oh shit moment, with all due respect to them, which is, oh, this is really complicated. Or wait, I just did a deal with a platform and there's all these hidden fees that I didn't even know about that we had already culled through and gotten out for them. Or, oh gosh, how do I even get my legal team to help work through this contract that's really cumbersome and difficult? And then when they go through all that, they've made the significant investment in a DMP, which we may or may not have helped them through that, or whatever they've done, and they're saying, we're not getting the value, or we don't know how to maximize the value, and they've come back and said, okay, we want to get somewhere in the, and we were never stepped away from any of those conversations. The notion of that in-house eradicates the necessity of an agency, I think, is what's problematic, and I love using problematic and programmatic together, or program manual, which is my other favorite, but
Problematic. Problematic. Go ahead. Now they're saying, okay, we went about this the wrong way. We took on the fear mongering and we have to go and do it all ourselves. We recognize the value that you've always said that you're bringing to the table. We want to hit somewhere in the happy median that is going to satisfy our business requirements and our use cases, and how do we navigate that? And I think the core thing that's oft forgot is, you know, to your point, Joanna, it's why do you want to do this? What's the motivation? What are you hoping to get out of it? I think it's how the agency team is organized, but the clients need to think about how they organize themselves. If you're going to fully manifest a DMP and data collection and getting serious about getting that in order, and then thinking about how you use it for your own purposes or beyond, you're going to have to change how you operate. You're going to have to change how your CMO evaluates your success and your media investment. You're going to have to change the way that you plan and activate, and you're going to have to be really rigorous about who has the permissions to touch these things and who doesn't, and how you're going to be a data first, irrespective of whether you deliver all that programmatically or not. That's the sea change needs to happen on the client organizational side and mindset side. So Ed, for you, I suspect you are seeing a rise in direct relationships. So please tell me if I'm right or wrong. And then tell me if you think the ones that are kind of coming to you for direct relationships are thinking about it the right way, or...
So, I mean, I think dataxu is a slightly different animal than some of the other platforms that have been out there for a while when it comes to this topic. What I would say is actually we're seeing a rise of agencies coming in, or agencies with clients. I think there's a stark difference, though, sort of as to how things are being approached, whether it's in-housing or with an agency partner. Like when a brand approaches us, it's more in conjunction than it is distinctly, right? Which is a change. Like you'd either negotiate a big agency deal or you'd go brand direct.
Yeah.
Now what you're seeing is that they're coming mutually to the table.
So
Who owns the paper? That sort of
less
stuff.
of an either or.
Less of an
more
either
like
or. But
and.
I do think, I mean, just to be clear to your point,
Yeah.
like we still see brands asking the question, should we in-house? What services can you provide for us? Which is like, that's an indicator to me that like they're correlating like in-housing to being able to shift some of the agency costs someplace else, right?
Yeah.
And we say, well, we're not in the agency business. Like that's a very distinct question than can I license your platform, right? Like those are different scenarios that clients are coming for. But I do think to echo Erica's point, I think like what we are seeing more brands come to us with is this notion of I made a big investment in some technology, whether it's a DMP or something else, and now I need to activate it, and I need
How the hell do I use this thing?
Right, and how can you help me connect? And typically, if it's a substantial brand, I think this is probably why Tracey's sort of having the conversation she's having. It's more about architecting an overall solution. Yeah. And then, for us, it's like, well, where can we plug any of our technologies, whether it's the DSP, whether it's sort of across device, whether it's reporting or insights, whatever it might be, into that overall framework. But so I think there's a mixed bag. And my last statement on this, going back to context really matters.
Totally.
The size of the brand is also going to determine sort of their approach and who their agency partner is and the quality of the work that they
yes
get.
and no, because you have companies like L'Oreal hiring droves of people. So
Sure. Yeah, no, right. But I mean, big brand. I actually would say like yes, and they can make that
because
decision.
it used to sort of be like, oh, well, if you're, Grubhub, that's one thing, but if you're a
Well,
CPG, that's another, and that doesn't seem to be true anymore.
Right, but also size, right? To your point, like mid-market brands may act very differently than a Fortune 500
Yeah.
brand when it comes to sort of where they in-house or out-house,
Outhouse.
We'll be the out-of-house.
Yeah.
We're going to take that one with us.
I'll take
how you
all my
should
outhouse
be
clients.
doing your analyst reports, in-house or outhouse.
Outhouse,
Yeah.
in-house or outhouse, those are your choices. We're basically out of time, so I just wanted one last thing. What are we going to be talking about in a year when we're talking about programmatic? David, in brief.
I really hope we're talking about how 2018 was the year in which we activated everything that was talked about in 17.
Okay, yep. Erica?
I really hope that in 2019, we are not talking about the same things that we've been talking about for years.
Amen. Ed?
I think it's going to be in the sort of decline of the size of the market.
Decline in the size
Not
of...
the programmatic market per se, sort of execution, but sort of the market participants.
Huh, okay, right, yeah, fair. Okay. How about you?
I think in 2019, we'll be talking about the measurement that we put in place to actually figure out what we should take out, what's working and what's not working in programmatic, so we can figure out what we should actually focus on.
I think it's going to be a renaissance of brand. I feel like
Has
it's
to
that.
be.
Yeah. Well, listen, you guys, this was so much fun. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's a great discussion.
Well done. Thank you guys very much.